When it comes to pastors, churches, and politics, silence is never an option. Welcome to Freedom Alive. What can pastors and churches do with regards to political activity? We should all know the truth and what our vital role is in educating God's people. I'm thankful to be joined again by my co-host, Matt Staver of Liberty Counsel. And Matt, it seems the greatest challenge for pastors and churches related to political activity lies in, first of all, understanding how the Bible relates to politics. The subject is so negatively viewed that many pastors completely avoid preaching anything politically related. But we're talking about so much more than a political party, so much deeper than that. And on today's program, you'll be interviewing Liberty Counsel's Holly Mead to discuss this biblical mandate and how pastors should respond.
Steve, it really depends upon your view of God. Is God confined to a silo, or is God Lord of all things? And sometimes we want to put God in a silo and we want to segregate certain things. And so something with regards to voting is over here, and Christianity and the gospel are in another area, and they don't mix together. But as we are transformed in our mind and our being through the relationship of Jesus Christ, we have to inevitably transform those things around us. We're not little islands isolated to ourselves. We are to go into all the world to preach the gospel, the good news, which is transformative to our being, to our life, to our soul and our mind. And when that happens, everything around us, everything that we touch, all of our environment also has to be transformed. We oftentimes look at voting as a negative political act, but frankly, voting is the appointment of an agent to act on your behalf. And when you want someone to act on your behalf, then you have to be very careful that the person is consistent with and reflects your will and your values. And we'll talk more about that in the program.
Very holistic discussion. We are delighted to bring it to you and your family. Our Freedom Alert is next.
Medical violence against children must stop. I'm Matt Staver, host of Freedom Alive. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and the Children's Hospital Association should protect children, but instead, they are demanding that the Department of Justice investigate and even arrest anyone who opposes puberty blockers and surgical mutilations for children. The organization sent a letter to the U.S. Attorney General Garland insisting that statements not affirming that a child's gender identity can be changed must be censored. They assert this so-called disinformation must be blocked, and people who spread it must be prosecuted for inciting violence. The organizations are also calling on big tech companies to act when information is shared. The idea that children can change their gender with puberty blockers, chemical castration, or by any other means is not only delusional, but medical fraud.
Up next, Matt's interview with Liberty Counsel's Holly Mead.
What can pastors and churches do with regards to political activity? Political activity oftentimes is a negative word in so many people's minds because, Holly, they associate political activity with different kinds of good or bad things with regards to a particular political party. But politics, particularly from a biblical standpoint, is not tied to a political party, and it's not to be considered a negative concept or a negative word.
Right. I mean, you look at God's Word, and it discusses various issues that would be considered political, you know, sanctity of life, marriage, immigration, taxes, things like that, that need to be discussed, but not particularly Democrat versus Republican, but those values that he wants us to understand.
You know, Dr. Jerry Falwell, back in 1973, January 23 to be exact, it was the day after Roe versus Wade, was a turning point in his life. If you go back to 1965, he preached a sermon called, indeed, talking about pastors ought to be in the pulpit, and their role was not to get involved in the political life of things, that pastors ought to stay behind the pulpit and preach the gospel. But then on the next day after Roe versus Wade, January 23, when Roe versus Wade came out on January 22, 1973, he read in the newspaper about what happened and that the Supreme Court had ruled on abortion. At that point in time, he said that he had to be compelled as a pastor to address this issue. And he completely changed. And to his very last breath, he always said that he was a pastor. You might have considered him to be political for those who knew his life, but he was always coming at these issues from a pastoral position. And he says, when the government moved into some of these biblical issues, like life, like the taking of innocent human life through abortion, he had no choice but to speak out on it. For him, that was not a political issue.
Right.
That was, correctly so, a biblical issue.
Well, you go back to Isaiah, he talks about when he prophesies about Jesus coming, in the song that we always know, he's Wonderful Counselor, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. The government is on his shoulders. The government is God's idea, and he is over it.
Well, in fact, if you look at pastors and churches and political activities, churches are very unique entities. Churches do not need any authority from the IRS to be tax exempt. Churches from the moment of conception, if you meet today and act and operate as a church, no matter how big or how small you are, but you're gathering together for study and praise and worship and fellowship as a church would do, you are at that moment tax exempt, and you don't need to apply to the IRS. That is a very significant component as we talk about what pastors and churches can do with regards to political activity.
And man, I think that issue really scares pastors, that they don't speak about political issues because they're afraid they're going to lose their tax exempt status. But you think about it, frankly, are you going to stand before the Lord one day and he said, or did you protect your tax exempt status, or did you preach my word to your people?
Well, there are actually two categories that are in the IRS code. One in 1934, which would be the lobbying provision. The other one is 1954, the so-called Johnson Amendment, when then Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, later President Johnson, became senator. He proposed this addition to the 1954 IRS code, and it says that if you're a 501c3 or a church, for example, you cannot endorse or oppose any person for elective office.
But I think that one issue, Matt, keeps pastors so afraid and so bound up.
Well, there's two reasons why I think it does that, and I know that because I served on a committee that was giving information to one of the members of Congress, overviewing all these nonprofit laws with regards to IRS code. And one of the committees that was there, that was organized, was a pastoral committee. One of the leading pastors in the country said that he kind of liked this political intervention provision in the IRS code. He knew that he wouldn't lose his tax exempt status, but it was an excuse that he could give his congregation for why he didn't talk about political activity. And that is no excuse.
No. Silence is not an option, right?
Silence is definitely not an option.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at the 1934 provision. The definition says that lobbying is supporting or opposing any local, state, or national laws. It includes voter initiatives. So if you have a constitutional marriage amendment or an amendment to protect the sanctity of human life, that's not an election, it is lobbying. So in that particular case, it says that in general, you cannot devote more than a substantial part of your organization's overall activity towards lobbying. And the general guideline, Holly, is 5% of your overall activity is okay, but 15% may cross the line. But let's put some meat on the bones here. Let's look at the 5% minimum. And let's look at what I would call a do-nothing church. Let me just explain. This church meets 3 hours on Sunday, and it has an hour-and-a-half midweek service. So total amount of time in a week is 4.5 hours. Literally outside the 4.5 hours, there's no activity. This is really a do-nothing church. Now, amazing, in that do-nothing church, what's 5% of 4.5 hours? That is actually 13.5 minutes. 13.5 minutes. That means that this do-nothing church every Sunday, 52 Sundays a week, could spend 13.5 minutes on the Sunday service advocating that the congregation support or oppose some local, state, or national law. Now, for example, if you don't say anything on this 1 week, then it's 2, and it's 13.5 times 2. And if you don't say anything for 2 weeks, it's 13.5 times 3. So in other words, as it goes through the cycle of the year, you're not going to have something local, national, or statewide that you're going to be addressing every single Sunday to oppose or support. So now it's looking at your overall activity throughout the year. Thus the reason why no church in history has ever lost its tax-exempt status for encouraging people to support a pro-life provision, a school board resolution, some kind of statewide law, a voter initiative, or a federal law. No church has ever lost its tax-exempt status.
But again, Matt, I emphasize, are you going to worry about standing before the Lord and saying, I protected my tax-exempt status, or I preached the word
Well,
to my
that's
people?
true. There's no question about that, and that's the main issue.
Right.
But even beside that, there's nothing to be concerned about. So you don't even have to spend time dealing with that. If you put a little bit of meat on the bones of this do-nothing church, a pastor that's paid 40 hours, an assistant that's 20 hours part-time, then you've got 5 people that teach the service, the Sunday or the weekend service, Bible study, and they're spending an hour of volunteer time. You add all of that, 40 plus 20 plus 5 plus the 4.5 hours that you're meeting, that's 69.5 hours. And 69.5 hours, 5% of which is 3.5 hours.
And think about the impact that small church can have on its people, and they will multiply and become and make disciples as well.
So your point is well taken, that obviously our call, particularly from pastors or Christians, is not from Uncle Sam, but it's from our God who created the universe.
Right.
And that's to whom we answer. So no matter what the consequences are here, that is our priority. However, there's no consequences. So get rid of the myth that your tax-exempt status is in jeopardy for talking about these issues. Now, what about the next area, political intervention? That's the big issue. That came into the IRS code in 1954. And this is a definite prohibition that a church or a 501c3 cannot endorse or oppose a candidate for political office. Now, under the lobbying, you could say that ABC Church supports this state law. But if it's a political candidate, if you would say ABC Church supports this particular candidate for office, that would cross the IRS line of this political intervention prohibition.
What about, I've attended churches where they've had political candidates attend and they'll stand up and introduce them.
That's perfectly fine. In fact, so here's what we can do. I mean, let's look at the church at Pierce Creek, and we'll show how this actually plays out in real life. It's a church that was in Binghamton, New York, and this particular church took out full-page ads in the USA Today and Washington Times newspapers. And in those ads, they publicly opposed, paying thousands of dollars for these ads, Bill Clinton for president when he ran for president of the United States. And then they solicited additional contributions to give more ads against Bill Clinton as president of the United States. So even in the political intervention, this church clearly violated the IRS 1954 rule. But it never lost its tax exemption, and not one contribution to it was ever considered taxable. So that is one of the worst case scenarios. And going back, Holly, to what you were saying, yes, there's all kinds of things without even crossing that line, as this church clearly did, still with no consequences notwithstanding. There's a lot of things that pastors and churches can do. And one thing is pastors and individuals that are preaching ought to preach always on biblical topics.
Absolutely. The sanctity of life, the biblical marriage, immigration, economics, tithing, stewardship. So many issues fall under
human
that umbrella.
Sexuality,
yes.
All of these issues.
That's a big one. I think a lot of pastors are afraid to touch on it, but then a lot of congregations are saying, we want you to talk about it. There needs to be truth.
And a lot of young people do, because we spend a lot of time with young people in a ministry that we created called Covenant Journey, and we go deep into the Bible with these individuals. And one of the things that I find is that there is a lack of teaching in the churches for them, and they long to have that depth in teaching. Because if we're not instructing them and speaking into their life in reality from the Scriptures, say, for example, on Sunday, you can better believe they're going to get it from some other source on Monday, Tuesday, and the rest of the week.
It's so important that we as a church influence the culture instead of allowing the culture to influence the church. And when you're not hearing those truths from the pulpit, that's what happens.
And there is no issue that's outside of the pulpit. Just because politicians are debating a particular issue, the budget, national security, other kinds of issues throughout the Middle East, just because they're debating abortion, marriage, the LGBTQ agenda, whatever it may be, that doesn't mean that that is a political issue. The Bible speaks to all things, and just because other politicians are speaking about it doesn't mean that it's off limits for you to speak about.
Right.
So preach on any topic, in season, out of season, always go into depth. Don't ignore any topic. And I think that's one of the problems with some situations today in churches, is that pastors outside of the tax exemption issue are concerned that you might alienate certain members because you're speaking on something that's uncomfortable, sensitive, controversial. And yet the Bible speaks to all aspects of life, and we must speak to all aspects of life.
And we need to understand that. Pastors can't be afraid if we're going to offend somebody. Well, Jesus offended a lot of people, but with the truth.
And with regards to the political issues, for example, let me just say this. I don't look at these as political issues. I look at them as biblical issues. All issues are biblical issues. And voting is not a political act. It's not a negative. It is the appointment of an agent. I can't be in the local politics because I'm over here doing something else. I can't be in the state capitol. I can't be in the United States Capitol voting on all these different bills. But my reach can extend to those places by appointing an agent to act on my behalf.
Right.
And that's what voting is. It's the appointment of an agent to act on your behalf. So, for example, you purchase a home or an apartment, a condo. You have a closing agent, right? And that closing agent acts on your behalf. Certain instructions are given to that agent, and they bind you by virtue of the instructions that you have told them to do. When you are voting, you are appointing an agent to act on your behalf. You will be held accountable with regards to how that agent actually acts on your behalf.
That's why it's so important we research. What are the values that these people represent? What are they saying they're going to do? And then you have to vote accordingly. You may not love everything about that particular candidate, but you have to look, are they representing biblical values?
And some people say, well, do you vote for the lesser of two evils? Look, people are inherently not necessarily good.
Right.
So you're always going to have different levels of good and bad on the ballot, the selection process. You're never going to have a perfect candidate unless Jesus is running for office.
Right.
But he has no need for office because he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's the only perfect candidate. Everyone else is going to have flaws. What you have to do is evaluate these candidates of whatever political party they are and line them up with biblical values and vote biblical values and appoint an agent that is most consistent with those values. So you can educate, pastors can, churches can, explain the positions of the candidates. That can be done through objective voter guides. You can also have candidates come and speak. You can invite them, you can encourage them to come, and you can acknowledge them in your congregation that they're running for office. You can encourage people to register to vote. You can assist them in various ways to register to vote based upon your different state. You can help people get to the polls by busing them to the polls or taking them to the polls.
And encourage them to get involved in elections and be a poll worker.
Absolutely.
Those are important as well as we as Christian citizens.
And very critically important to go out there and be involved and take that day so that you can have some training and go out there and make sure that the polls are run properly.
Right.
Pastors can also lend their name. So, for example, I could say Matt Staver, pastor of so-and-so, or Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Council. And I could have my name in a brochure or on a website supporting or opposing a particular candidate. The IRS says that you can have your name as the pastor and your title associated with your church or your nonprofit organization supporting or opposing a candidate, so long as after your name or title you have an asterisk. And the asterisk down somewhere in that same presentation, brochure or website, says title and affiliation for identification purposes. And you can certainly, personally as pastors, you can directly financially support, lend your name. Obviously churches can't give financial contributions to candidates, but you can have, one of the things I like is candidate forums, where the church can invite candidates to come up on a platform, and you can have Q&A, and you invite all the candidates. And if certain candidates don't show, that's their decision. But have them there, let the people know where these people stand.
Kind of a friendly debate, so to speak.
That's right, that's right. So really, Holly, I think your point that you've stressed at the beginning, which I totally agree with, and that is, we serve our Lord, and when God convicts us to speak on something from the pulpit or otherwise, we need to speak. Tax exemption, at the end of the day, are you going to say, well, Lord, I didn't speak about this because I thought we would lose our tax exempt status? Which is really silly, because God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills.
Right.
Look at all the political campaigns that raise millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, and not a dime of it is tax exempt. So don't worry about that. But on the other hand, there's no need to worry about it, because no church has ever lost its tax exemption for engaging in lobbying or for political intervention. No church has ever lost their tax exemption. So I want to encourage pastors, churches, Christians all over the country to replace the muzzle that the world wants to put on you and exchange it for a megaphone. Take off the muzzle and exchange it for a megaphone. And Liberty Counsel, we have lots of information that pastors and churches and other Christians can obtain. You can go to lc.org, and you can click on the Churches tab, and there's a lot of information there. There's the do's and don'ts, so to speak, of political activity and intervention. But I think, Holly, in closing, obviously we have a biblical mandate.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, this myth of losing your tax-exempt status is just that.
Right.
It's overblown.
Have to remember that Caesar is not Lord. When Jesus came on the scene, the Romans thought that Caesar was the Son of God, that Caesar was king. And Jesus came and said, Jesus is king. He is over. The government is on his shoulders, and we have to remember that.
You are the light of the world, and in the presence of light, darkness flees. God bless you, and may you rise up in this generation, every generation, to make a difference.
Matt, I really appreciated the clarity that you set forth in that. I mean, as we all work to really educate God's people, it's amazing how the enemy can get in the middle of that, and with fear or uncertainty or doubt, all of a sudden, to your point about the muzzle and the megaphone, we've kind of traded a megaphone in for a muzzle, when what we really want to do is turn the muzzle into a megaphone.
Yeah, that's right. When you think about it, churches are the largest segment that meet on a regular basis every week. And yet sometimes we're ineffective, but God wants to free us up. We need to live in the light of the resurrection, and with the understanding that the gates of hell are not going to prevail against God's church. And in boldness and in confidence, and obviously in love and in the Spirit of Jesus Christ, be able to express that to the world. There's no topic that's off limits. And we cannot ignore these issues of elections and voting, because these individuals, they pass laws. For example, when it's about the sanctity of human life, how did we get to where we were with Roe versus Wade in 1973? It's because people were elected to office in the president's position of the United States of America and in the United States Senate that ultimately put these judges or justices on the bench. And then we lived under this terrible abortion ruling from 1973 to 2022. And then you have other situations in other areas where you are able to protect the sanctity of life, but if you don't do it and you simply drive by these clinics and you have no concern about the slaughter of innocent humanity that's taking place there, and you actually, worse, vote for somebody or allow someone else to vote for you, which is even worse, to put somebody in office that would actually pass bills, support legislation that would continue the slaughter of innocent children. We have to have compassion, but we won't be held accountable for that. And we have an incredible opportunity to have a transformative effect in the community around us and in the nation in which we live.
I agree. We've talked about it before on Freedom Alive, but the concept of biblical values is, I think it's almost like the enemy has clouded things in another way by couching things in politics. Politics, this negative term. But your exhortation about preach on any topic and biblical values, if we just thought of it as biblical values instead of politics.
Yeah, it's really biblical values, and the Bible speaks to everything that we encounter in life. So biblical values are throughout the Bible and those biblical principles. And as we believe and act on Sunday, or as we should believe and act on Sunday, we need to actually carry that out on Monday and Tuesday when we go to the ballot box or whenever we vote, throughout all the rest of the days of our life.
For those at home, can you talk to them about ways to get involved behind these ideas, with these ideas in mind?
Well, one of the things I would think that you want to do is pastors become educated about this, and people educate your pastors, and not only your pastors, but other people in your congregation, in your community. So you can go to Liberty Council's website, lc.org, click on the Churches tab right there on the front page, and there's lots of information there regarding churches, not only on this topic, but on a lot of other topics as well. lc.org, and click on the Churches tab.
Hope, peace, light, and truth. We love bringing these issues to you and your family to help you make the best decisions. As Matt said, let's exchange our muzzle for a megaphone for God's Word. In closing, remember Galatians 5, verse 1, which says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. So join us here next time, where you'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.